Goedenavond allemaal. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening by Radboud Reflect and the Hotspot for Sustainable Democracy. And tonight we're going to talk about how to save democracy, which is, I dare say, a rather urgent question. So let me first see whether I can read the room a bit. So whom of you is concerned or worried about the state of our economy? If you think so, just raise your hand. Okay, 25%. Okay. Now, whom of you is concerned about the state of our democracy? Okay, 90%. Okay. Now, whom of you is concerned about the impact that economic inequality and corporate influence has on our democracy? Nearly everyone. Well, lucky you, you're in the right room. That's exactly what we're going to talk about tonight. My name is Chille Tempels. I'm an assistant professor in political theory at Radboud University, but tonight I'll be your moderator or your host. And we're very happy that we have with us today Lisa Herzog, professor of political philosophy at the Rijksuniversiteit Groningen. She's one of those scholars that's working on economics, politics, and democracy. And she brings this all together, which is great because I do think there is not enough attention to really looking at the intricacies on how these fields work together and maybe even infringe upon each other. So what are we going to do tonight? We're first going to listen to Lisa, who's written this beautiful new book on the democratische markt, or the democratic market. She will tell you all about this in just a bit. After her lecture, we will engage in a conversation with her. I won't be doing that alone. I will be doing that together with my colleague Gaard Kets, also assistant professor in political theory at Radboud University. And then during our conversation, of course, afterwards, there will also be room for questions from you, from the audience. Yeah, that more or less wraps it up. So I yield and I give the floor to Lisa Herzog.
Hi. Oh, this is strange light. Can you tone it down a bit? Well, I can see your faces a little bit. So I will try to react if you all look very puzzled, then I've probably used a term that I shouldn't have used without explanation. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to talk about, well, the title wasn't chosen by me actually, how to save democracy, but it is something I'm deeply worried about, and probably many of you also. And I want to start with a very rough distinction between two ways of thinking about what's actually going wrong in our democracies at the moment. And when I say democracies here, I'm thinking of the West. I'm not competent to speak about all of the world, but if you look at what's happening in the US at the moment, right-wing populism in many European countries, that's the phenomenon I'm taking here for granted as a background. So there is this perception that democracy is under threat, and you get two camps of explanations, as it were. The first is cultural explanations. Something's not going well in our culture, and that's why people get polarized. There's all this talk about wokeness. Some people speak about the comeback of religion. And the idea is that, well, it's all these cultural developments, maybe backlash against previous, more emancipatory cultural trends and developments. That's what's putting our democracy under threat. Now, I'm not saying that this is all wrong, but I think one needs to look at least also at the other camp, which is economic explanations. And here you get into other questions and other kinds of explanations. You mentioned inequality and corporate influence. That's one way of looking at it. Compatible with that is also to look at, well, we've not had a lot of economic growth in many countries, at least not growth that would have reached normal people. A lot of the growth of the last 30, 40 years went to the owners of capital, not those earning money with their work. There's also a question about the scarcity of certain kinds of resources. Not everyone can have the kind of career that may have been promised to them. The idea that everyone can have social mobility, how does it work? Because if everyone rises, then everyone is a step further up, but still at the same relative position. So what does the economic system do? And what does that mean for how democracy functions? And in a way, I don't want to only ask about economic explanations in the sense of who earns how much and how are resources distributed. But I also want to ask, what values does our economic system actually express? And that then connects it back to the cultural question. And are these values in line with the democratic values that democracy needs to be stable? Now, my talk is going to be divided into 2 parts. The books are the long version, and I'm not going to be able to say everything here. But first, I'll introduce my general argument here, which is that we've not paid enough attention to how undemocratic our democracies actually still are, and in particular, how undemocratic our economic systems are. And if you look at the longer historical arch of emancipation, fights for voting rights, for the masses, all these things, for a long time, fights about how to reform the economy and how to reform the system of power, the political governance of a society, went hand in hand. But in the last decades, these struggles have come apart. And then I'll focus on one chapter of the books in particular, which is on our role as workers. Who in this room here has worked or still works for a living? Same here. Most people, maybe not students. You'll get there, probably. But in our societies, almost everyone has to work. And there is a real question about whether people who don't have to work because have so much money, whether that should actually be the case. But if we all have to work, there is a real question of what it means to work as citizens. Why do we think about work the way we currently do? And what does that mean for how we can or cannot be good democratic citizens? So that's what I'm going to talk about, and I'm sure that will then deepen the discussion about workers also in the conversation we have afterwards. So if you, like me, grew up in the 1990s, there was this sense that humanity had arrived at the final stage of a long development of looking for the best way of running modern societies. Francis Fukuyama, an American political scientist, said we had reached the end of history after the fall of the Iron Curtain. He has revised this by now, but what he meant at the time was that humanity had learned how to govern modern societies, namely you need democracy in the political realm and capitalism in the economic realm, and a bit of welfare state maybe, but he was convinced at the time that the one big alternative system in the East, planned economies, had failed, and therefore no further development was necessary. And so you had this picture that democracy and capitalism were the successful power couple, and the rest of the world would just have to catch up on these things. A very Eurocentric or US-centric vision of the world, you might say. I would say that today things look very different, and maybe they always look different. It was just a temporary perception at the time. We have a choice to make, I would argue, that we have to either pick up this older threat in the fight for emancipation to also democratize the economy, or we are really at risk of losing our democracies as political systems. Now, these things often get discussed in separate discourses. When you think about how universities are built, you have the economics department and you have the political science department. Newspapers have an economics part and a political part. And the idea that stands behind this is that these are different social spheres and they follow different logics. And the political sphere should be guided by democratic principles. I mean, nowadays, even that is not something you can take for granted anymore. But at least in Europe, lots of people would still say, yes, at least they pay lip service to democratic principles. In the economic sphere, in contrast, different values reign. And you often hear things about efficiency or economic growth as the overarching goal for the economy. And sometimes that's even presented as a kind of value neutrality of the state. If the state doesn't care about the detailed goals or aims of economic actors, but instead stays neutral and just says, just let the economy grow, that was often understood to be best in line with the principle of liberal neutrality of the state. And that was then contrasted with a planned economy in a totalitarian state where the state would meddle with everything. And that's, of course, a very extreme dichotomy where if that's the choice, then maybe, okay, you would want to go for separate spheres. But I'm going to argue that this is a wrong dichotomy and we have other choices in front of us. The current form of capitalism got us a lot of inequality, all the very well-known ecological problems, and also, and that's something that's getting more and more into public discourse and academic discourse, lots of threats to social cohesion. We cannot take for granted anymore that people are well connected to others. The World Health Organization has described loneliness as a global pandemic. And there are lots of questions about what that then means for democracy. But that's not the only thing. What's maybe even worse, or at least intellectually, I would say it's a kind of bankruptcy, is that our very understanding of what democracy is or can be has been narrowed down and has been reduced to a kind of economic model of citizen behavior. And that's an old line of research where you use the same behavioral models that you have in economics, where people choose between jobs or between consumer products. That also gets applied to politics. So you choose between different offers that are somehow made by others, and then you have all kinds of theorems about how voters will behave in that choice situation, as if it was the same kind of choice that gets made in the economic sphere. And so the citizen becomes a kind of passive consumer, and all questions about active citizenship, maybe something like responsibility, old-fashioned words like duty, falls out of the picture, which you can also see in the tendency that has been commented upon a lot, that there's a lot of talk about rights, which is important, of course, but there's not so much talk about who has what kind of responsibilities to make sure that these rights are secured for everyone. So you get a very one-sided picture of democracy, and this, in the long run, is not sufficiently stable to maintain democratic systems as we have them today. I'll briefly say something about the history here, but I'll really be brief because I think lots of these things are quite well known. Historically, after World War II, you had what political scientists call the primacy of politics, in the sense that democratic politics could at least roughly set the rules for the economic game. You had higher taxes on profits and high incomes. You had more welfare state institutions. You had ambitious ideas about giving every child a true chance to achieve the same thing as every other child, independent of their background. And so you got this kind of embedded capitalism that seemed a pretty good combination or compromise. But then there were economic thinkers who, over the decades, really conquered the public sphere, and they did lots of rhetoric, convincing. They had vignettes about how to make a pencil that tried to get the message about free markets across to people. They had TV programs, and they had the Mont Pelerin Society. And so over time, they really shifted the discourse in the direction of a more market-based way of thinking. Ordoliberalism gets sometimes invoked, so that's the idea that the state should set the capital order and then let everything run its way. The Chicago School often gets invoked here. Milton Friedman, Friedrich August von Hayek, these thinkers. And then, I mean, neoliberalism has become a bit of a bad name and capture all notion. But what's usually meant is this disembedding of capitalism with the globalization of finance and the financialization of the producing economy, more service jobs, less union power, and a lot of pressure on public institutions with the idea that they need to be like markets. They cannot follow a different logic. A university, for example, has to serve the students in the way that businesses serve customers, as if this was exactly the same kind of logic. And these kinds of beliefs were then implemented first in the US and the UK under Reagan and Thatcher, and over the years have also influenced lots of institutional decisions in other countries in Europe. So where we are today is this critical point where the question really is, can we go on with this economic system? And of course, I'm not the first and will not be the last to criticize this economic system. But what you often get is a sense of, well, this is not going well, but often you get no alternative proposals. Or I should actually add, there are lots of things coming up, mushrooming in different places under different labels about alternative economic systems. But what we don't have at this point is a sort of large-scale, big-picture alternative. Now, the proposal that I want to make is to say, well, we have a system of values that we can actually use to think about the economy, namely democratic values. And by this I mean democracy not as it's currently lived, but more as an ideal, which will always sort of stand a bit apart from the reality, but can provide guidance for how we could improve reality. There is this quote that democracy and the realization of democratic principles is like riding a bicycle. You must never stop trying to do better, otherwise you'll fall. So it's this dynamic idea that democracy is an ideal to be realized. And the key values here are the equal moral status of all members of society, mutual respect, reciprocity, so values that you find expressed, for example, in the idea of one person, one vote, which is not quite so easy when it comes to non-citizens, but let's bracket that for a moment. But that's the idea that we all are the same, we should all govern society together. And in contrast to that thinned out understanding of democracy, where it's just about making a choice between parties every 4 years, what I mean by democracy is also what John Dewey has called a way of life. So not only concerning the political system, but concerning how people relate to each other in their daily lives, in society at large. And that's a way of thinking that's influenced, as I said, by Dewey, but also thinkers like Axel Honneth, Elizabeth Anderson, and lots of other democratic theorists who think about democracy as something more than just going to participate in elections. So the question then becomes, what does it actually mean to carry these values into the economic system? And what kind of institutions would we need for that? And because our economies are pretty complex, you then have to look at different institutions somewhat separately, although in the end it all needs to fit together coherently, of course. So take markets. Markets are sometimes presented as being per se democratic, because in a market you make a free choice. No one can force you. And if there's competition, you have a choice to make. So that sounds as if it expresses an idea of freedom. Lots of real-life markets are not like this. And they don't really enable fair, mutual forms of reciprocity, but rather are marred by one-sided market powers and end up with what lots of scholars, especially from Latin America, have called extractivism. So one side extracting value from the other side through their position of power. And so when we say, from a democratic perspective, that we want to have markets in our economy, the question is always, what kind of markets are those? And do we really want to have all goods traded in markets, or are there also limits? Second question, and I will zoom in on that later, is what kinds of companies do we actually want? What kind of work organizations? Sort of funny that we speak of our economic systems as market economies, whereas the daily experience is at least as much like company economies, in the sense that people work in companies or in public organizations, which, in a kind of classic distinction that Coase introduced, are hierarchically structured and not structured by exchange. You don't buy or sell your labor power on an hourly basis. Unless you're in the gig economy, that's another question. There you have the market principle at work, but that's not what most people experience. So then the question is, what kind of companies are actually compatible with democratic principles, or might even support democracy? How collaborative are they? Is work organized as something where we can see the complementarities between each other's contributions? Or is it an experience where you just have to take orders and obey some authoritarian boss or company board that decides everything for you? Also, what kind of orientation towards growth or post-growth or degrowth should our economic system have? There's the huge environmental question, and there is a big and very passionate discussion between defenders of green growth and defenders of post-growth. But from a democratic perspective, growth per se can't be judged as good or bad, because it depends on, well, what kind of growth is it? Which function of the economy is emphasized? What is maybe de-emphasized? Do we grow in oil consumption? Do we grow in alternative energies? Do we grow in better healthcare services? So we need to have a more fine-grained discussion about what the functions of our economic system actually are. And finally, one question that I find very interesting also personally, and whenever I talk to people, they nod as if this is something they also experience. Everyone's too busy, apparently. No one has time for anything. But that, of course, also does something with us as citizens. What do we make time for? And what kind of time politics, as you might call it, do we have? And do we actually make enough time for our role as citizens? Or is it something of these things where, oh yeah, one day I'll take some month off and then I'll realize something that contributes to democracy, and then you never get there? Now, you might say this all sounds nice and a little bit naive, because efficiency. So this is something I get a lot. What about efficiency? Now, I think this is an objection that one needs to take seriously, not only because we want the system as a whole to be reasonably efficient, but also because in their daily lives, people don't like experiencing inefficient processes. That can be very frustrating. Everyone knows this from Kafkaesque bureaucracies and so on. But I think one needs to unpack what efficiency actually means and how this word gets used in discourse about the economy. The notion of efficiency that you usually find embedded in economic models is Pareto efficiency. And that means basically avoidance of waste, in the sense that you don't have more opportunities for exchange that would improve one agent's position without deteriorating anyone else's position. If you can still make changes so that someone benefits and others don't lose, then that's inefficient, according to that notion. That's a missed opportunity, you might say. And then there's another notion which sometimes gets used, where you also look at the winners and losers of change and how the winners could compensate the losers. And this all sounds pretty harmless. Why wouldn't one want these kinds of things embedded in an economic system, you might ask? But Julien Legrand, a British philosopher and economist, has argued This is all right, but it's not a first order end, because you first need to decide what you want to achieve as a society with your economic system, and then you can ask, how do we achieve this end efficiently? So it's not a trade-off between, for example, equity and efficiency. It's maybe a trade-off between equity and individual freedom that can be reached in a more or less efficient way. And so in that sense, economic notions of efficiency are compatible with very different outcomes, very egalitarian or very inegalitarian ones that can all be efficient. What we need instead is to first discuss what kind of first-order goals we want to achieve, or maybe compromises between different goals. Life is full of compromises. But then you can ask, well, how do you reach those in an efficient way? But making efficiency the goal is logically inconsistent because it's about the means and not about the end. And I would even go further and say that in today's world, the problem that we are facing in our economies is not that there's a huge scarcity of essential goods. We have learned how to produce enough stuff for everyone. The problem is much more, how does it get distributed? Who has access to what goods? How can they be produced in a more sustainable way? And sustainable in an ecological and in a social way. So efficiency sometimes gets erected as this big goal, and then sometimes you also get a connection to, well, economic growth. The economy needs to grow. But that focus often overshadows other questions about inequality, power concentrations, also the distribution of respect, for example, between different kinds of jobs. And just saying, oh, this might be inefficient is not enough to counter these questions, I would say. Also, I would hold that there are lots of sources of efficiency that are undervalued and underestimated in today's economic thinking. For example, when people can trust each other, they often have very short lines and they can work very efficiently together in small teams. But that's a kind of efficiency that many economic theories would not see because trust is not even a notion that enters these models. And so in that sense, what counts as efficient and what doesn't is often a bit biased. Now, one last general issue. You might think that this is all a battle of the isms. You have capitalism, you have socialism, you have maybe other isms. Now, I've thought about these questions in these terms for a long time, but I've come to think that this is pretty unhelpful, actually. And it's partly because I operate in different languages. So I'm a native speaker of German, now I try to speak Dutch, and my working language is English. And when you read the news in these different languages, and then if you add French and Spanish, it would get even broader. What people mean by capitalism and socialism is pretty diverse. In the US, socialism gets used for what here would be considered pretty centrist, like health insurance for everyone. Is that socialism? So in that sense, it's often a bit unclear what exactly people mean. But also, this is really a dichotomy that we have inherited from the Cold War era, when you had these two blocks in the Western world. And it's not at all clear that these are the only two options of how institutions can be built together to form a coherent system. And it makes us overlooked, I think, that lots of premises for how we could rethink the economy are actually shared by people across a pretty broad part of the political spectrum. And even in the US, where you might say, oh, they are so polarized, they cannot have anything in common across party lines, you find interesting constellations. For example, there are certain libertarians there, so people who are very much in favor of free markets, who are critical of crony capitalism in a way that is actually in substance quite similar to what many leftist critics mean when they speak about domination. Of course, there are different views in the background, but when it comes to politics, you could have alliances here if you get out of this dichotomous way of thinking, oh, the ones want socialism and the others want capitalism, because the question is, what concrete institutions do they really want? And just finally, I already mentioned this a little bit, this is also about a thicker kind of democracy, where democracy is really a way of life, with active participation and not just votes between technocratic proposals, where democracy is embedded in daily life and in how we live together and treat each other. And that means two forms of democracy that have been distinguished in academic discourse. So you get deliberative democracy and participatory democracy. Deliberative is very much coming from Habermas and also John Rawls and so, and it's about public discourse. Who can participate in public discussions, whose voices get heard, whose proposals get picked up, and so on. Who sets the frames for many questions. That's important, but participation goes further in the sense that it really involves people participating in concrete decisions that matter for them. And that gets you more in the direction of, for example, local democracy. So involvement of citizens in local decision-making in the places where they live, but also, and that's the bridge to my second part, in the economy. And by the way, there were all these money notes at the beginning on the picture. I'm going to bracket the financial system here, but if that's something you want to discuss, I've thought about it a lot. I don't have the solutions, but I think there's a lot to be said for what it would also mean to democratize finance. So if that's something of interest, we can pick it up later on. Now I'll move to workers. And here I've been a bit dichotomous myself, namely by entitling this chapter in the book Underlings or Citizens. And what you got, especially after COVID, was quite an interesting phenomenon, namely people started to openly speak about not liking their work anymore. That's particularly remarkable if you start from a culture where the work ethic is really very deeply ingrained. And that's the case in the Anglophone countries, but arguably I think in the Netherlands and the German-speaking world, this is also pretty deep. It's a matter of honor that you work hard and you identify with your job and so on. But after COVID, you got, for example, quiet quitting. Do people remember that? That was the idea that you keep your job, but you just do the bare minimum to not lose it. But you don't really engage with it anymore. Or you got things like the lazy office girl meme, where especially women working in offices were posing as being really lazy on the job and finding that cool instead of finding hard work cool. Now you might say, that's maybe just an online meme wave that will die down. But it did raise some questions about, well, what do people actually expect from their jobs? And after COVID, when many people returned to the offices or sometimes factories from their home offices, there was this sense that, well, maybe the world of work could also be different. Maybe it could be organized in other ways. But this has still not really led to massive political changes. And there is a question of whether the Overton window in political discourse for this has closed again. I hope not. But from a democratic perspective, it's really an interesting question of what work means for people today. Do they experience it as exploitative, or do they see it as a labor of love, or maybe both? And also, do they see their workplace as a matter of always having to compete with others in a kind of rat race where everyone's running to stand still? Or is it also a community of people working together and helping each other out in solidarity? And the big question from the perspective of democratic theory is what people experience in terms of democratic values. And to what extent they can maybe learn to be citizens at the workplace. I will focus here on paid work, but I want to really explicitly acknowledge that democracy also needs many other forms of work that are not paid in families, in neighborhoods, volunteering, activism, all these things. For now, I'll focus on people's jobs, as it were. And the key question then is, how is that paid work organized? And is that in line with democratic values? So the classic workplace is one where one has hierarchies of divided labor, in the sense that there are different rules, there are different roles, there are maybe pyramids in the organograms, in the sense that every layer that has more power is also smaller. So a kind of organization that historically we saw in the army and in the church, and that has still survived into today's work organizations. But within these workplaces, you often see two logics at work that can go together, but sometimes also really clash. On the one hand, you have a logic of collaboration. You have different people contributing to a joint project. There are synergies, there's teamwork. For example, everyone in the teaching team of a school or university, from the secretary to the teachers to the people who clean the classrooms, everyone is in a way contributing to the project of making sure that good teaching can take place here. But there's also a logic of command, which is very much, well, power sits at the top determines what gets done, and then it gets sort of, it gets put down in policies or strategies that every layer of the organization has to follow. And historically, especially in the years after World War II, these hierarchies, despite all their disadvantages, they offered certain advantages, at least for male breadwinners. For women and for non-white people and for migrants, it often looked a bit different, but they had certain virtues, you might say. They were often pretty stable, because the bigger they were, the more they had a kind of insurance function internally. They offered job security. You had internal labor markets, in the sense that people could climb the ranks, maybe become one of the bosses themselves. At least as long as they were willing to submit to the logic of command of what their bosses wanted from them. That's sort of the old world of work, you could say. In the last 10 years or so, but it started earlier, but in the last 10 years it really took off with the internet, you also got a new form of work, which lots of researchers have described as precarity, where you get a lot of flexibility, but you don't get a say. And the most paradigmatic form of work where you see this is digital platform work. So the delivery riders that don't have a work contract, but just click on accept for one task, they do it, it's finished, they get a payment, and that's it. Or people who do online digital work, where you have a lot of flexibility. You can do as much or as little of that as you like. You can fit it in the rest of your life. And in that sense, you're your own boss. And that's also how these platforms or apps advertise these working opportunities. You decide how much you want to do. You don't decide how much you earn. You have no security. The pay per hour that results tends to be very low, especially if you also count all the time that it takes to find a task, to orient yourself on the platform, to maybe develop a bit of an understanding of where to actually earn money. So there's a lot of unpaid time that goes into these jobs. And if you take that in, then the average hourly salary is really pretty low. And there are typically no opportunities for development. So the idea of having a career really doesn't apply to these kinds of jobs, for better or worse. And you're managed by algorithms. You don't have any voice. There's no chance of deliberating together. It's you against an app. And lots of these workers, there's a lot of funny empirical evidence, they have fascinating ways of tricking these apps and getting it to do things that they want. So, for example, putting their smartphones into particular places where they think they get better writer jobs than when they keep them with them. But it's not in any way a discussion or a boss that you could negotiate with. Now, that's the choice that people often have these days. Either you submit into a hierarchy, or you're in this precariat of flexibility, but at very bad long-term conditions. Now, there's a different way of looking at work from a democratic perspective, which really emphasizes different things. And that's what I want to put forward here. And I think lots of people actually have democratic ideals about work in the back of their minds, but they don't necessarily get a chance to live up to these. From a democratic perspective, you could see work as a matter of mutual benefits in a web of complementarities. I can do my work because other people do other work. Some people care for the food, others care for safety, and we all depend on each other. And from that perspective, you'd also want a fair distribution of the benefits and burdens. The level of inequality of wages that we currently have is pretty incompatible with that picture. And also, you would want a division of labor that doesn't treat certain people as just cogs in wheels, like Charlie Chaplin in modern times, you know, working at a car factory. But you really want opportunities for everyone to develop themselves. And here an interesting distinction is between the technical and the social division of labor. The technical division of labor means dividing it into tasks, but the social division means that it can then be distributed differently onto different people. Now, I said at the beginning that since at least the 19th century, lots of struggles for emancipation have also concerned the organization of work. And there are lots of ideas out there from this history, but also from contemporary research about how you could organize work more democratically. You can distinguish here between representative and participatory models. Representative means that you elect people who are your representatives, who speak for you. That can happen at the board level or in worker chambers in companies or in some other way. That's mostly about representing workers' interests in the governance of organizations. But there's also the participatory dimension, which is about how people actually get to participate in the governance of their own work. And then this is more about teamwork or joint deliberation and really the self-governance of work. Where it all comes together are worker cooperatives. And one of the questions that I'm really interested in, maybe not someone knows the answer, is why are there not more worker cooperatives in the Netherlands? Maybe something for discussion later. Now, I said earlier that there is this big question of what work does to people as citizens. In the empirical literature, this is called the spillover thesis, which is this idea that if your workplace is democratically organized, you can also be a better citizen. And there's a lot of research going on at the moment trying to explore how this works exactly. I can say a bit more about this later if you like. But what's pretty clear from all these studies is that there is a relation. There is a relation between what people experience at the workplace and how they vote, to what extent they engage, what kind of citizens they are. And so in that sense, for thinking about how to save democracy, we need to look at how work is organized. Now, you might ask again, can democratic work ever be efficient? And I want to briefly respond to some of the worries here. I think of this issue as a kind of toolbox approach, in the sense that different models of democratic participation make sense for different kinds of work. It depends, for example, whether you need specialized skills or you have large teams, small teams, emergency situations or not. Different things will be efficient in different contexts. But also, there are different sources of efficiency here, and they are not the same as those you get in markets. There's those that matter for organizations. One interesting one is the so-called epistemic argument for democracy. So epistemic in philosophy is always related to knowledge. And here the idea is that if people have a say in how work gets organized, then everyone's knowledge and skills and ideas can be brought into the process, and that can increase efficiency. And there are also issues, which I mentioned already a little bit, about motivation, about trust, that can actually increase efficiency. Also, this may be a bit controversial, but I think if we had digital tools that were not just the ones run by profit-driven corporations that want to get as much of our attention as possible, they could actually be tools for empowerment instead of control. And they could help us lower the costs of communication and sharing information more widely. I think in the long run, people who organize their private lives in app groups will not want to have a boss that just dictates things if they could deliberate with their colleagues in an app group instead. There is even a question here about whether this will also careen the economy if you let people participate more. It's a plausible hypothesis to say, well, if workers have more of a say, they will want a cleaner planet. Maybe it's not that easy, but there is some research that gives reasons for cautious optimism here. I don't think it's an automatism, though we need still other measures for greening the economy. Now, I'm about to conclude, but I want to briefly say something more about how we could get there. And different countries are in different places about where we are at the moment. Until the 1970s, roughly, there were lots of fights for increasing worker participation in many European countries. And these old European co-determination institutions, they are often still there, but they are often perceived as bureaucratic, old-fashioned stuff, not relevant for young people. Startups should be free from them, and so on. Funnily enough, at the same time, you have new approaches of agile work. For example, holacracy is a new approach for participatory decision-making with fewer hierarchies. But these two things coexist without a lot of connection between them. And sometimes the old union people are distrustful of the new work people and vice versa. I think if these could be brought together, that will already help us a lot. I also mentioned work cooperatives, and there's something interesting here about European demography, because we are in a phase where lots of business founders are retiring, their children don't want to take over the companies, and the question is, will they fall to some big company, or could they become ownership of the employees? And I think there's a lot of work that can also happen on the ground. And in a sense, I want to suggest to all of you, well, go to your workplace, try out some things here. There's a lot to be done. Experiment in self-governing teams, for example, or learning processes about how we can use new technologies better in a really participatory way, letting everyone in, being transparent about decision-making, and so on. I think we are in a phase where these digital tools can be used for good or bad, and we can use them also for good if that's what we want. I'm running out of time, and that's why I'll stop now, but I'm very much looking forward to discussing this further with the two of you and then everyone in the room. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry.
Okay, no, that's okay. So, thank you, Lisa. I think we have a lot to talk about. Also joining us is Gaard Kets, my colleague, also at Radboud University. Gaard, I would like to start with you. You've been listening to this. Your work is on radical democracy, communalism, revolutions. So, bearing all that in mind, what struck you most in the story Lisa just told us?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting that this whole debate about economic democracy is basically living up again now, mostly maybe in academic circles, some bigger circles maybe tonight. I think that's very interesting. It's a very old tradition of thinking about democratizing the economy. My own research has been with, for example, the workers' councils during the revolution in Germany, 1918, where also workers took over factories and started to experiment basically with how can we organize this workplace in a democratic way. And so it's a very old debate coming from Marxism, for example.
Even older.
Even older, yeah, for sure. So there's also a lot of philosophers who've thought about this idea. So I'm really happy that, and we've seen some moments that this debate got relived again, if that's a word, like in the 80s, maybe in the radical 60s, in the student movement. And it's very good, I think, that we're now starting to have this debate again, or that we're continuing this debate. So I think that's great. I think you propose some very convincing philosophical arguments why, from a democratic perspective, we should go after the final bastions of autocracy, which is the workplace. So I think that's very, very interesting. As a political scientist or a political theorist, maybe your proposals so far have been a little bit light on the actual institutions that you're proposing. So you mentioned some general ideas of representative methods and more participatory methods. So maybe during the talk we can discuss a little bit more the institutions, but maybe on a more general level, what resonated with me, also based on my own research, the moments that you see the democratization of the economy really live up in practice are moments where the general, like the formal authority is gone, right? So it's in the settings of crisis, political crisis, economic crisis, or revolution. So this is why I'm not completely convinced that the strategy, the political strategy that you propose here of fixing the boat on open sea, this is, I think, the metaphor you use in the book. So tinkering and experimenting and then just seeing what sticks. As a method to get to a democratized economy, I'm not so sure how convincing this is to me, also because we know that the older experiments that we had with democratizing the economy, you mentioned the co-determination. I'm in co-determination myself. It's not very much fun. You don't have a lot of power in Dutch co-determination, a little bit more in the German case. So it's a very much a watered down version of the kind of experiments and the kind of ideas that were there about democratizing. So I'm afraid, or I'm skeptical that this kind of tinkering and experimenting would lead to even more disappointments with people who are involved in this. So I would like to ask you, how do you think that we can indeed, this is a successful, why do you think this is a successful strategy this time around? Why do you think that this will not be corrupted or co-opted by the ruling powers, which to some extent also happened with the New Work movement, the project. So I think this is a serious constraint that we have to take into account. I would like to hear what you think of that. And maybe as an alternative proposal, there's now work that is based on the same principle of experimenting. For example, Graham Jones has written about assembly movements and these kind of experiments with radical democracy that we've seen from Occupy, that we see now in many social movements as well. And he calls this the shock doctrine of the left. So basically his argument is that as people on the left, which I assume people that are interested in democratizing the economy are, what we need is ideas, institutions, practices that we have experimented with and that we can impose once there is another crisis. So once there is a downfall of authority, once there is a crisis happening, that we have the institutions and the ideas ready, that we've practiced with them. And I will stop talking. But this is also what you saw in 1918, right? So this was when the revolution broke out, when the workers were taking over factories with their councils. This was based on the experiments of many women that had organized strikes with the very same institutions in the years before this. So this was a tried and tested form of doing radical politics in the workplace. So I would like to propose, is this not a better way to conceptualize the way towards change? So preparing for a big strike, so to say.
Should I?
Yeah.
Yes and no, I would say. I'm very much in favor of developing the tools that we will need after a big breakdown, crisis, whatever you call it. But I'm not sure that we should have to wait for that. I think lots of revolutions haven't worked out very well for women, so maybe that's also the back of my mind here. Maybe it's part of me doesn't want to hope that it has to get so much worse before it can get better. Maybe that's the case, but I still want to believe that there are also lots of situations that are sort of crisis for particular institutions that could also lead to change. So, for example, when a small or medium company has the choice because, okay, we could be bought up by a big corporation and then we know what's going to happen to us, or we might be able to transform ourselves into a worker cooperatives. And there are tried and tested instruments from other countries in Europe that could be used to support workers in such endeavors. So my hope is that social learning can also happen without the one big rupture where it's very hard to predict what will happen, what forms of violence it will involve, and so on. So I'm still hoping that change that ends up really being transformative can happen without that. But I'm also convinced that we also need to develop the tools that would be ready if something like that happens. Neither you nor I can predict whether it will happen. So in that sense, I'm agnostic on that. And in that sense, it's compatible. But hopefully we don't have to wait for that.
Yeah, so building on the metaphor, so you talk about this in the book, like we can either try to repair the ship on open sea, or we can maybe Gaard burn the ship and come up with something completely different. What kind of are the same time it seems that if we stick to the ship, you fall back on the same old model. So what kind of alternatives do you see there, or why should we stick to the ship then?
Well, the way I use the metaphor, it's building on Otto Neurath's idea that a ship could be completely transformed by replacing plank by plank while it's on the open sea. We don't have a place where we could go on land and then burn the ship and have a new society made for us. So in that sense, we have to work with what we have. We have the same people that are living now, and we need to make changes with them. There are questions about sort of what parts of the ship are most in need of transformation, so that this can trigger other changes. And I think for that, questions about time politic are actually really interesting, because lots of people, if they had more time on their hands, they could do so much more to transform also other things. There is also a big question about ultimately the financial system. In some places, people who had more time on their hands would set up alternative currencies, for example, in order to strengthen the local economy against big corporations and so on. So I think time politics could really be transformative. But I do admit that there may be other planks in the ship that really need massive restructuring, and finance is a good candidate, I think.
Okay. So we can, of course, I mean, there are tons of more academic things I would like to discuss, but at the same time, I used to have this friend. Yeah, I used to. He's a lean manager. And I was talking to him once about efficiency, and when I was rereading your book, you make a clear case. You make a case against efficiency, right? To some extent, we first need to come up with these first-order goals, and then efficiency can be a way to reach that goal. Now, I can see that, but that doesn't necessarily imply that the whole process should be democratic. I mean, we can deliberate all together and think of, okay, what values are at stake here, and then we elect a manager or a nice enlightened autocrat to do the things we thought of. So, to what extent how far should this process of democratization go? Based on the efficiency argument, it might be that we deliberate, not very efficiently, but okay. And then someone in an efficient way starts enacting what we thought of.
Yeah, that's where what I call the toolbox approach comes in, because I think that really depends on the context. In the emergency room of a hospital, you don't want democratic deliberation. You want the quickest measures to save the patient's lives. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't have deliberations before and after people are in the actual operating room, or that you could have elections for certain roles. And I'm not even against electing managers. I would not want them to be dictators. I think there always needs to be counterpower, and I think the terms need to be limited so that they can also be elected out of office. But in certain contexts, the division of labor between people who coordinate and people who execute, that can make sense in certain contexts. It often can also make sense if the people who coordinate know that they will return to be among just the workforce, so that they only make rules that they themselves will also have to live under.
Right.
So in that sense, there are lots of different ways in which you can implement this, and ultimately what matters is who has the power. And what you don't want, and you ask about cooptation and risk of corruption, is that you only get pseudo-participation. And you talked about co-determination in the Dutch system and in Dutch universities. You can have a lot of pseudo-participation in the sense, everyone can give feedback on this proposal, and then nothing of that is ever seen back in the final version, and these kind of things. That's not what I mean. But I think we still need to be pragmatic about what works in different contexts.
Yeah, so there's not like one ideal type of workplace democracy or democratic system we would envision, but we would have to look like per sector what this could look like and what would work best, as long as the people deciding over us can be held accountable and they have to circulate.
Although I have to say I have a certain predilection, let's say, for worker cooperatives in the sense that you don't have the problem of there being this other group of people called shareholders or investors, because in worker cooperatives you really have one group of people who are the owners and the workers, and that just gets you, that avoids lots of problems that you have in other constellations. especially in today's system of finance where shareholders would expect returns and would expect them fast. And so in that sense, work cooperatives are, I think, one of the purest forms of workplace democracy you can get.
So would that be an ideal, you say we should strive toward? And because there are alternatives like the German Mitbestimmung, but also like newer initiatives of bicameralism, where the shareholders have a say in how the firm is run, as well as the workers. How do you view those kinds of democratic alternatives?
I think they're far better than a lot of what we currently have, but I would see them more as transition strategies towards purer forms of worker determination. Although I should also say that depending on what kind of institution we're talking about, sometimes you don't want only the workers to determine what's going on. For example, in a hospital, the patients would have to have a voice. In universities, you want students to have a voice. So you'd need complex governance structures. And there is a real role about, okay, and which organizations exactly need shareholders in the mix? I think that's a good question. But if you think about it as not the big break and the big revolution, but sort of a transition strategy out of the current system, then something like bicameralism, where you have one chamber for the shareholders and one chamber for the voters, the workers, that can be an interesting intermediate step towards something fuller, participatory and democratic.
Okay.
Can I maybe expand on that a little bit? If that's okay?
Yeah,
sure. So it does strike me that in the alternative, so it's not in your book and also in your talk, you very barely talk about the role of capital. So obviously when we give workers more of a say in the workplace, this means that the role of shareholders, of those that bring in capital, diminishes, which I think is good. But then what remains in your model? So once we start tinkering and we build and say we end up with an economy that is more democratic than it is now, maybe close to ideally democratic. I think one of the elements that you still have in that model, if I understand correctly, is the mechanism of markets. So the values that markets deal with have changed a little bit, I think, or a lot, I think. So we go from exploitative markets or extractive markets towards more productive markets, but still the mechanism of the market is still there, it seems. And I wonder how, so does this whole mechanism of the market not fundamentally or inherently undermine democratic values that we come to support with this kind of system? So, for example, the role of competition. So even if we have perfectly democratic workplaces, worker co-ops or other forms of democracy, do you not fear that the competition that we as worker co-ops in between each other have to engage within the competition in this kind of market, does this not undermine all kind of other values? Because, for example, it stresses a lot more the effect of efficiency instead of other. So are you not still bringing in or keeping in there the mechanisms that have led to the exact same things that we're trying to fix when we talk about democratizing the economy?
I would distinguish two things here. So one is investment and how we organize investment. And you could have public investment, you could have long-term investment that's for profit, you could have long-term investment that is for a fixed return but not for maximal profit. I think that there are lots of possible models, and somehow in the economy you need an investment function. And we'd have to have a discussion now about what actually is money and who creates money and how can you sort of get the investment process started. Do people have to save first, or can the central bank just create money? But I think that there are really interesting questions about how to bring in democratic control over the investment function. That's one thing. The other thing is the role of markets. And here, I guess, first of all, I think competition can be bad, but competition can also, if regulated well, have certain positive features. And democratic systems are also based on competition to some extent. Depends a bit on which model of democracy you have, but I think a certain degree of competition can help societies that have a plurality of values and interests to hold the powerful to account, in the sense that if they do something that voters or consumers don't like, they have alternatives. So as long as you want that, you're sort of accepting that competition can sometimes have a function. And the question is, does it have to undermine other values? And I think that depends a lot on how markets are combined with other institutions and how they are regulated. So for example, if you have a good social safety net so that unemployment isn't the kind of threat it often is today anymore, then labor markets, in the sense that, well, people can lose jobs under certain conditions, look different than if you don't have this. So I think it depends a lot on the context, and I think that if you give people certain freedoms about the choice of material goods, then a certain degree of competition is difficult to, you cannot completely keep it out of the system. So the question is not how to completely kill it, but more how you can channel it the right way. And in that sense, I think it doesn't have to be erosive of solidarity, but it depends very much on how it's done.
Can I briefly, because you mentioned now the idea of freedom, and it struck me that among the democratic values that you mentioned, freedom doesn't really play a role for you, or at least, so there's equality, there's the right to respect, and so on. But there's a lot of people working in the field of democratizing the economy that work from the conception of freedom. So for example, from a Republican perspective, so the idea of non-domination. So democracy at work is important because this is a place where we're dominated by our bosses, by managers, which means that we're unfree. And this is one of the things that democracy can do, is it can contribute to our liberty, or it presents the liberty that we have in choosing the conditions under which we live and under which we work. So I was wondering, why is liberty for you not one of the core values that democracy serves here?
I guess because liberty has been hijacked so much by economists in the sense of negative liberty as the absence of state interference. And you now use a different conception of liberty, liberty as not being dominated by others. I would say that non-domination is only possible if you have alternative power structures, and for that ultimately you need a kind of positive freedom in the sense of being free to do something together, and that leads me to democracy. So in that sense, freedom in a positive sense is already built into my understanding of democracy here, and non-domination for me is a very important idea, but it's a negative idea about what to prevent, and I want to combine it, or if you ask how do we achieve that, you need a notion of positive freedom, of people's agency, people's participation, and that's why I'm using that vocabulary. But it's very much coming from an idea of positive freedom of the individual, but also of groups and teams and workforces and so on.
I was wondering, you asked the question, so why are there so few co-ops in the Netherlands?
Worker co-ops,
Worker co-ops, yeah. That's actually something we're pondering upon as well, but to make it more empirical, so indeed why? Do you have an idea on, like, on a more European, on a more global scale, there are a few worker co-ops, Mondragon being one of the examples that's the
Really
most
famous,
successful, pretty famous. Are there any cues on why that one is successful and others are not?
There's a lot of research on this, and I'm trying to read up everything, and it's quite noteworthy that there are sort of pockets of cooperative economies in northern Spain, in Basque Country. That's the famous Mondragon group. It's actually a whole group of cooperatives. And also in Italy, in the Emilia-Romagna, you have loads of cooperatives, and also lots of research on cooperativism going on there. And the question is, why only there and not in other places? And the research that I know points to, well, first of all, this being known and being a credible model. In lots of other places, cooperatives have just been dismissed as, this doesn't work. They are often not taught. When you study management, I don't know what it's like here. I think in Groningen you don't learn about the possibility of cooperatives. So there's a knowledge gap. But there's also a cultural background in the sense that people in these regions get to know the cooperative values, and a considerable number of them then opts for working in these contexts, which may mean maybe somewhat lower incomes than if they decide to have a big career somewhere in the capital of the country, but they value the lifestyle and the kind of work and the way in which people deal with each other in these regions. And then you might say, well, is this just something about these local places? But I think it's again maybe something about, well, once it gets established and there's a critical mass of people doing it, others can follow. And so the question becomes, how do you get this critical mass started?
Yeah, exactly. One thing that puzzles me in a sense, but this is more of a macroeconomic question, I think, that how can you survive as a worker co-op among these firms that are still autocratic and might be able to at least make decisions in a faster way, which could be more efficient, I don't know. But so how can you survive in such an environment? And if not, would we then need more stringent regulation saying, okay, we need X amount of co-ops, because otherwise they will, despite how nice and democratic they are, they simply won't survive in a competitive market.
Well, the fascinating thing is that they do survive in some markets.
Right.
And so the question is, why is that? And I'm not sure there's a general answer. In the US, you have them a lot in forestry, for example. Right. So why is that? But once they are established, cooperative companies have even a slightly higher long-term survival rate than comparable companies. So it's more a matter of getting them off the ground. Now, how do they survive? Why do they survive? They have certain cost factors, like maybe decision-making takes longer, but they also have factors that help them. For example, people are really engaged because it's their company. And so in that sense, the motivation structure and the relations are very different, and you don't have so much absenteeism, fluctuation in the workforce. So that's what I meant earlier when I said briefly, well, there are different sources of efficiency. And these factors can then play a role. Sometimes you also get customers that appreciate cooperative production and are willing to pay a slightly higher price.
Because they're buying at a worker co-op.
But this often hasn't worked very well, so they often do need to compete at market prices, but many of them manage.
Can I ask a more political question? Is that
sure.
okay?
Yeah.
So when the motivation here is to save democracy. I think there's a couple of threats for democracy at this point. You pointed them out very well. I think one of the major threats that I'm seeing now is the rise of the extreme right and of fascism. So basically the political question is, how do we make sure, or what leads us to believe that a democratic workplace does not basically swap our current autocrat for an elected fascist? So how can workplace democracy save us from the rise of fascism or the extreme right, but also how do we keep fascism out of the workplace more than it is there now?
So the first question here, I'm not saying that, if only all these people who now vote for right-wing parties had a nice workplace in a cooperative, they would suddenly vote differently. But there are empirical studies that show that if people feel respected at work, if they feel that they have a say, if they feel that they can do things together with their colleagues, so they have a sense of agency at work, this is at least correlated, who knows what the causality is, but it's correlated with more pro-democratic attitudes, less racism, less sexism, less anti-Semitism, all these things. So that's why I think that changing something in the economy will help save democracy, but I don't think it's the only thing. I think we also need to talk about inequality. We need to talk about the relation of respect between different types of jobs. So I think there's a lot that needs to change, and I've just focused on one dimension here. The second question, then, how do we keep fascists out of democratic workplaces? Well, this is not only a theoretical question. So in some places in Germany where you do have pretty strong co-determination, the AfD, the right-wing party, tried to get into the Works Council's elections, and the unions were really trying to fight back. One answer is to say, well, workplace democracy would need to have the same checks and balances that democracy at the national political level has. So protection of minorities, the possibility of going to a court if you disagree with a decision, and so on. So I think that's part of the answer. The other part of the answer is also that insofar as there are still structures where democratic parties and unions and so on can be in these roles, it's also a very concrete struggle on the ground to try to keep right-wing people out of these structures. And that's also an opportunity for companies, insofar as they still have a bit of a conscience to position themselves. Some of them do, with mixed success, let's say.